The needle slipped from Margaret Walsh's fingers for the third time that morning, and she pressed her trembling hands against the pine workbench to steady herself, knowing that the world she had built with thread and fabric was slowly fading into permanent twilight. She was 24 years old, and the doctor in Taylorsville, Wyoming, had told her 6 months ago that her vision would continue to deteriorate until eventually she would see nothing at all. Some hereditary condition that had no cure, no remedy, no hope. Her mother had gone blind by 30, and Margaret had watched it happen, never imagining the same fate would claim her before she even reached her prime. Now the edges of everything blurred like watercolors left in the rain, and the fine stitching she had once done with pride required 3 times the effort and concentration. The dress laid across her lap belonged to Mrs. Henderson, who needed it finished by Sunday for her daughter's wedding. Margaret squinted at the hem, brought it closer to her face, and carefully threaded the needle again. Her small shop occupied the front room of a modest cabin on the eastern edge of town, where the grasslands stretched toward the mountains. She had moved to Taylorsville 3 years ago after her mother passed, seeking a fresh start in a growing town that needed a seamstress. The work had been steady, her reputation solid, but now every commission felt like a battle against her own failing body. The bell above her door chimed, and Margaret looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the bright September sunlight. She could not make out his features clearly, only that he was extraordinarily tall and broad-shouldered, filling the doorframe completely. "Are you the seamstress?" His voice was deep and rough, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. "I am, Margaret Walsh." She set down her work and stood brushing wrinkles from her blue cotton dress. "How can I help you?" The man stepped inside, and though her vision was compromised, Margaret could see he was unlike any customer who had ever entered her shop. He wore buckskin pants and a heavy coat despite the mild weather, and his dark hair fell past his shoulders in waves that suggested he had not seen a barber in years. His beard was thick, but trimmed close enough to see the strong line of his jaw. But what struck her most was his sheer size. The muscles of his arms strained against his shirt sleeves, and his chest was as broad as a barrel. "I need a shirt," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Maybe 2, mine are falling apart." "I can certainly help with that." Margaret reached for her measuring tape, then hesitated. "I will need to take measurements." "That is fine." He stood perfectly still as she approached, and up close, Margaret could smell pine sap, leather, and wood smoke clinging to him. She had to reach up considerably to measure his shoulders, standing on her toes to get the tape across his back. His muscles were solid as oak beneath the worn fabric. "You are not from town," she said, more statement than question. "No, I live up in the mountains. Weston Garrett. I trap mostly, hunt some. I come down every few months for supplies." "How many months has it been since your last shirt?" Margaret asked, noting the frayed collar and the patch on his shoulder that had been crudely sewn with leather cord. "Maybe a year. I am not good with a needle. I can see that." She finished her measurements and stepped back, writing the numbers in her ledger, though she had to hold it close to her face to see the lines properly. "It will take me about a week. 2 shirts in sturdy fabric, nothing fancy, just strong." "That will be $4 total." Weston reached into a leather pouch at his belt and counted out the coins without hesitation. "I will be in town until Monday. Can you have at least one ready by then?" Margaret calculated quickly, if she worked late tonight and tomorrow, setting aside the other projects. "Yes, I can manage that." "Good." He turned to leave, then paused. "Your eyes, they trouble you?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so careful, had learned to hide her struggle. "What makes you say that? You hold everything close, and you did not look at me directly when I came in." "You looked at where I was standing." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It is nothing, just tired from close work." Weston studied her for a long moment, and though she could not see his expression clearly, she felt the weight of his gaze. "If you say so." Then he was gone, the bell chiming his departure. Margaret returned to her workbench, but her hands were shaking again. No one had noticed before, or if they had been too polite to mention it. The fact that this stranger, this mountain man who probably spent weeks alone in the wilderness, had seen through her careful facade in minutes, unsettled her deeply. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, finishing Mrs. Henderson's dress and then starting on Weston's shirt. She chose a heavy blue cotton that would withstand hard use, and as she cut the pattern, she found herself thinking about him. His size, certainly, but also the way he had stood so still while she measured him, as patient as the mountains he came from, and his directness. No dancing around observations, just straight questions. By the time she lit her evening lamp, her eyes were burning, and the fabric seemed to swim before her. She pushed through anyway, determined to keep her promise. Finally, near midnight, she set down her needle and rubbed her temples. The shirt was half finished, and tomorrow she would complete it. She was locking up the shop when she heard footsteps on the wooden sidewalk. Her hand went to the small pistol she kept in her pocket, a habit born from living alone. "It is just me." Weston's voice came from the darkness. "I saw your light was still on." Margaret relaxed slightly but kept her hand near the pistol. "I am working late to finish your order." "You should not work so late, not if your eyes are bothering you." "My eyes are fine," she said, the lie sharp on her tongue. "And I do not recall asking for your concern." "No, you did not." He stepped closer, and in the moonlight she could see him better than she had in the shop. His face was weathered but younger than she had first thought, maybe 30 at most. "But I will give it anyway." "There is a meanness to working yourself sick." "I am not sick, I am busy. There is a difference." "Is there?" He crossed his arms, and even in silhouette she could see the flecks of muscle. "When did you last eat?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer, then realized she could not remember. "Breakfast, perhaps. That is none of your business. The hotel is still serving. Come eat." "I do not need you to feed me, Mr. Garrett." "Maybe not, but you are going to fall over if you do not eat something, and then I will not get my shirt." There was a hint of humor in his voice now. "So it is purely selfish on my part." Despite herself, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. "When you put it that way." The hotel restaurant was nearly empty at this hour, just a few travelers at a corner table and the owner's wife cleaning up for the night. Weston ordered steak and potatoes for both of them without asking what Margaret wanted, which should have annoyed her but somehow did not. When the food came, she realized how hungry she actually was and ate with unladylike haste. "Thank you," she said when her plate was clean. "I did need that." I could tell. Weston was watching her with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "How bad are your eyes?" Margaret set down her fork carefully. "Why do you care?" "Because I have spent the last 8 years alone in the mountains, and in that time I have learned to notice things. Details. Signs, and you have all the signs of someone who is going blind." The bluntness of it stole her breath. No one had said it so plainly before, not even the doctor. "The doctor says I have a few years before it is complete. But it is happening." "Yes." The admission felt like defeat. "It is happening." Weston nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already known. "That is why you work so hard. You are trying to save money before you cannot work anymore." "I am trying to survive." Margaret's voice came out harder than she intended. "I have no family, no husband, no safety. This shop is all I have, and when I cannot see to sew any more, I will have nothing. So yes, Mr. Garrett, I work hard and I work late, and I will continue to do so for as long as I am able. What will you do after? I do not know." It was the truth that kept her awake at night, the fear that clawed at her chest. Marry whoever will have me, I suppose. Hope he is kind. Weston's jaw tightened. That is a poor plan. You have a better one. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the table. Maybe. But first, tell me what you like, besides sewing. The question was so unexpected that Margaret laughed. What do you enjoy? What makes you happy? I do not understand what that has to do with anything. Humor me, Margaret thought about it. I like stories. I used to read constantly, but now it is too difficult. The words blur together, I miss it terribly. What kind of stories? Any kind. Adventures, romances, mysteries. I loved getting lost in another world. She smiled sadly. I have a whole shelf of books I will never be able to finish. Weston leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. I have a proposition for you. What kind of proposition? I have a cabin up in the mountains. Good size, well built. I spend winters there trapping, but come spring, I am usually traveling. It sits empty most of the year. He paused. You could live there. In exchange, you could mend my clothes, maybe cook when I am around, and I could read to you. Margaret stared at him. You want me to live in your cabin, alone with you in the mountains. I did not say it was a perfect plan. But it is better than marrying some stranger who might treat you poorly. At least with me, you would have shelter and food and books. I have a trunk full of them. Why would you do this? You do not even know me. Weston's dark eyes held hers, and for once, she could see them clearly in the lamplight. They were gray, like storm clouds. Because 8 years ago, I lost someone I cared about and I could not help her. She died hard, and I have carried that with me every day since. I cannot help her, but maybe I can help you, and maybe being able to help someone will ease that weight I have been carrying. The raw honesty in his voice made Margaret's throat tight. I do not need charity. It is not charity, it is a trade, your skills for shelter, and maybe company. It gets lonely in those mountains. People will talk. People always talk. Does it matter what they say if you are safe and fed and have someone to read you stories? Margaret wanted to say no, wanted to insist she could manage on her own. But the truth was, she was terrified. Terrified of the darkness creeping in from the edges, terrified of becoming helpless and dependent, terrified of ending up like her mother, who had spent her last years in a charity ward, broken and forgotten. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Fair enough. I will be here until Monday. You know where to find me. Weston stood, dropping coins on the table to cover their meal. Finish my shirt and we will talk again. Margaret worked through Saturday, completing Weston's first shirt and starting the second. Her mind kept circling back to his offer. It was outrageous, improper, possibly dangerous. She knew nothing about this man except that he was large, direct, and had once lost someone he cared about. That could mean anything. But it could also mean exactly what he said. A chance at security. A chance to hear stories again. A chance to not face the darkness alone. Sunday morning, she delivered Mrs. Henderson's dress and endured the woman's effusive thanks. The coins added to her savings felt heavier than usual, each one representing the finite time she had left. She spent the afternoon finishing Weston's second shirt, taking extra care with the stitching even though her eyes ached from the strain. Monday morning, Weston appeared at her door just as she was opening the shop. She handed him the wrapped package containing both shirts. "Try them on," she said. "Make sure they fit properly." He stepped into the back room, and when he emerged wearing the blue shirt, Margaret could see it fit him perfectly. The fabric stretched across his broad chest and shoulders without pulling, and the sleeves were exactly the right length. He moved his arms experimentally, testing the range of motion. "Good work," he said. "Better than anything I could buy ready-made. That is the advantage of custom tailoring." Margaret folded her hands to keep them from trembling. "About your offer." Weston went very still. Yes. I have conditions. Tell me. I want my own room and my own bed. Whatever arrangement we have, it is a business agreement, not anything else. Agreed. The cabin has 2 bedrooms. And I want to be able to leave if things do not work out. You bring me back to town, no arguments. Agreed. And you will read to me every evening. A small smile crossed his face. Every evening by the fire, I promise. Margaret took a deep breath. Then yes, I will come with you. The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Margaret sold most of her furniture and supplies, keeping only her personal belongings, her books, and enough sewing materials to handle basic mending. She paid her landlord through the end of the month and told her regular customers that she was closing the shop due to health reasons. The news spread quickly, and she endured countless questions and concerned looks, but she told no one about Weston or where she was going. Weston returned with a sturdy wagon and a pair of horses on the following Sunday. He loaded her belongings with the same efficient patience he seemed to apply to everything, securing each trunk and box carefully. Margaret took one last look at her little shop, at the front room where she had built her business, and felt an unexpected pang of grief. This had been her independence, her proof that she could survive alone, and now she was leaving it behind. "Ready?" Weston asked, offering his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. His hand was rough with calluses, but his grip was gentle. Margaret settled onto the seat, arranging her skirts. "As ready as I will ever be." The journey into the mountains took 2 days. They followed rough trails that wound through pine forests and across clear streams, climbing steadily higher. Weston proved to be a surprisingly easy companion. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful. He pointed out landmarks, warned her of rough patches in the road, and stopped frequently to let the horses rest. They camped the first night in a clearing surrounded by aspens that were just starting to turn gold with the approach of autumn. Weston set up a neat camp with practiced efficiency, building a fire and preparing a dinner of salt pork, beans, and fresh trout he caught from a nearby stream. As they ate, the stars emerged overhead, more numerous than Margaret had ever seen in town. "I forgot how many stars there were," she said softly. "I can still see them, at least. The big things. It is the details I am losing." "Then we will appreciate the big things," Weston said. "Mountains, stars, sunsets, plenty of those up here." After dinner, he pulled a book from his saddlebag. "I brought this to start. It is called The Last of the Mohicans. Have you read it?" "No, I have heard of it but never had the chance." Weston opened the book, angling it toward the firelight, and began to read. His voice, which had seemed so rough in normal conversation, smoothed out as he read, finding a rhythm that brought the words to life. Margaret closed her eyes and let the story wash over her, feeling something tight in her chest begin to ease. He read for over an hour before stopping. "That is probably enough for tonight. We have an early start tomorrow." "Thank you," Margaret said. "That was wonderful. We will read more tomorrow night." The second day took them even higher into the mountains. The trail became steeper, the air thinner and sharper. Margaret found herself gripping the wagon seat as they navigated switchbacks that seemed to hang over vast drops, but Weston handled the horses with absolute confidence. "How much farther?" she asked after they stopped for a midday meal. "A few more hours. We will be there before dark." Weston's cabin appeared in late afternoon, nestled in a small valley surrounded by peaks. It was larger than Margaret had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Behind it stood a small barn and a shed. A creek ran nearby, its water sparkling in the slanting sunlight. "Welcome home," Weston said, helping her down from the wagon. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly well appointed. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a solid table with chairs, and comfortable-looking furniture. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books, tools, and various supplies. A doorway led to a kitchen area and two more doors open off the main room. "Your room," Weston said, opening the door on the left. Inside was a bed with a thick mattress, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a lamp. A window looked out toward the mountains. "I built most of the furniture myself. It is not fancy, but it is sturdy." "It is perfect," Margaret said, and she meant it. The room felt safe, cozy, worlds away from her uncertain future. They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading the wagon and settling Margaret's belongings. Weston carried her trunks as if they weighed nothing, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt. Margaret organized her few dresses, her sewing supplies, and her precious books, arranging them on a small shelf Weston had in her room. That evening, Weston made dinner while Margaret explored the cabin more thoroughly. The kitchen was well stocked with preserved foods, dried herbs, and cooking implements. The second bedroom, which she glimpsed through its open door, was spartanly furnished with just a bed and a chest. Weston's room, clearly, after dinner, they settled into chairs by the fireplace. Weston added logs to the fire until it was crackling warmly, then retrieved the last of the Mohicans from his pack. "Shall we continue?" he asked. "Please." As Weston rayed, his deep voice filling the cabin, Margaret felt herself relaxing in a way she had not in months. The story carried her away from her worries, from the slow death of her vision, from everything except the adventure unfolding in the words. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, and inside, the fire crackled. And for the first time since her diagnosis, Margaret felt something like peace. The first weeks at the cabin established a routine. Margaret woke early and made breakfast while Weston did morning chores, feeding the horses and checking his traps. She spent her days mending his clothes, which had accumulated in alarming quantity, and learning her way around the cabin and its immediate surroundings. Weston had been right about the big things. She could see the mountains, the trees, the broad strokes of the landscape. It was only when she tried to focus on details that her vision failed her, turning everything to soft blur. Weston proved to be an attentive guide. He walked with her around the property, describing landmarks and showing her the safest paths. He was patient when she stumbled, offering his arm for support without making her feel helpless. And every evening, after dinner was cleared away, he read to them by the fire. They finished the last of the Mohicans and moved on to Ivanhoe. Then, a collection of Shakespeare's plays that Weston performed with surprising skill, giving each character a different voice. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years, found herself looking forward to each evening's reading with an anticipation that felt almost childlike. "Where did you learn to read so well?" she asked one evening in early October. Snow had begun dusting the peaks, and the nights were growing cold enough that they needed the fire burning all evening. Weston looked up from the book, a collection of Edgar Allan Poe stories. "My mother was a school teacher back in Ohio. She insisted all her children learn to read properly to appreciate literature. I had 3 sisters, and we would take turns reading aloud every evening." His expression grew distant. "She would have liked you." "Would have. She died about 12 years ago. Fever took her and my youngest sister in the same winter. My father followed the next year, just gave up, I think, could not live without her." "I am sorry," Margaret said softly. "And your other sisters married and moved away?" "I stayed for a while, tried to keep the farm going, but after my father died, I just needed to get away from all those memories. So I went west, ended up in the mountains, and found I preferred the solitude." "You said you lost someone 8 years ago, the one you could not help." Weston was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Her name was Sarah. We were going to be married, but she got sick, some wasting disease. The doctors could not do anything. She went from healthy to dead in 6 months, and I watched it happen, helpless. After she died, I came up here. Did not want to be around people, around their pity and their sympathy. The mountains did not pity me, they just were. And now you have brought someone else who is dying slowly into your mountains, Margaret said. You are not dying. You are losing your sight. There is a difference. Sometimes it does not feel like there is. Weston set down the book and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. When Sarah was sick, she told me something. She said that being alive was not about how long you lasted or whether your body worked right. It was about the moments that made you feel something real. Joy, fear, love, excitement. Those moments were life, and everything else was just waiting. He looked at Margaret directly. So no, you are not dying. You are living, just differently than you expected. And I aim to help you have as many real moments as possible. Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. Thank you, Weston. No need to thank me. He picked up the book again. Now, shall we find out what happens in this story? I believe there is a mysterious visitor at the door. As October progressed, Margaret found herself settling into mountain life more completely than she had imagined possible. She learned to navigate the cabin without needing to see every detail, memorizing the placement of furniture and supplies. She improved her cooking, learning to make bread and preserve vegetables from the garden Weston had planted in spring. And she continued to mend his endless supply of damaged clothes, though she worked more slowly now, feeling her way through the stitches rather than seeing them clearly. Weston was a constant, steady presence. He never pushed her, never made her feel inadequate. When she struggled to thread a needle, he would thread it for her without comment. When she could not see to chop vegetables finely, he would take over that task and let her handle the cooking. He seemed to instinctively know when she needed help and when she needed to manage on her own. But beyond the practical support, Margaret found herself drawn to him in ways she had not anticipated. She noticed the way his face softened when he read particularly moving passages. She appreciated the strength in his hands, which could split logs with ease but handle books with surprising gentleness. She found herself watching him when he worked outside, admiring the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he chopped wood or hauled water. And sometimes she caught him watching her, his gray eyes thoughtful and warm. One afternoon in late October, Margaret was outside hanging laundry when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A deep, huffing grunt came from the trees beyond the cabin, followed by the crash of something large moving through the underbrush. Weston! She did not scream, but her voice was sharp with fear. He appeared around the corner of the cabin within seconds, a rifle in his hands. Inside. Now. Margaret did not argue. She grabbed the laundry basket and hurried toward the cabin, her heart pounding. Weston backed toward the door, the rifle trained on the trees. Then she saw it, a massive brown shape moving between the pines. A bear. Keep moving, Weston said calmly. Do not run, but keep moving. They made it inside, and Weston barred the door. He moved to the window, watching through the gap in the shutters. Margaret could see the bear more clearly now, a huge grizzly that had to weigh over 500 pounds. It was sniffing around the area where she had been hanging clothes. Why is it here? Margaret whispered. Probably smelled the food in the root cellar. They are feeding hard this time of year, getting ready for winter. Weston kept his rifle ready but did not raise it to fire. Most times, they will wander off if you do not threaten them or get between them and what they want. They watched for 10 tense minutes as the bear investigated the area around the cabin. It approached the root cellar door, sniffed it thoroughly then, apparently deciding it was too much work to break in, lumbered off into the trees. Weston waited another 15 minutes before opening the door and stepping outside cautiously. Margaret followed, staying close behind him. "Is it gone?" she asked. "For now. But it knows there is food here, it might come back." He looked at her seriously. "From now on, you do not go outside alone, not until I am sure it has moved on or denned up for winter. Understood, understood." Margaret realized she was shaking. "I have never seen a bear that close before. They are impressive animals, beautiful in their way, but dangerous." Weston put a hand on her shoulder and the weight of it was steadying. "You did well. You did not panic." "I was too scared to panic." He smiled at that. "Sometimes that is the best way to handle fear." That evening, as Weston read from a collection of Washington Irving stories, Margaret found her attention drifting from the words to the man reading them. He had protected her without hesitation, had put himself between her and danger as naturally as breathing. The realization of how safe she felt with him was both comforting and unsettling. She had not intended to develop feelings for him. This was supposed to be a practical arrangement, nothing more. But her heart, it seemed, had other ideas. November brought snow, first in light dustings that melted by midday, then in heavier falls that began to accumulate. Weston spent more time around the cabin, winterizing the buildings and stockpiling firewood. Margaret helped where she could, but increasingly she found herself dependent on him for tasks that required clear vision. "I feel useless," she said one evening after stumbling over a pile of firewood she had not seen in the dim light. "You are not useless." Weston set down his book. "You cook, you mend, you keep the cabin organized. Those are not small things. But I cannot help with the heavy work. I cannot check the traps or hunt or any of the things that actually keep us fed." "Can you skin a deer?" Margaret blinked at the non sequitur. "What?" "Can you skin and butcher a deer? Because I shot one this morning and it is hanging in the cold shed and I have been dreading the work all day." "I have never tried." "Well, neither had I until I learned. Come on, I will teach you." The butchering lesson was messy, awkward, and strangely intimate. Weston guided her hands, showing her where to cut, how to separate the hide from the flesh. He was patient with her mistakes, and when she finally managed to remove an entire haunch properly, he praised her as if she had accomplished something magnificent. "See," he said as they worked, "you can do hard things. You just need to learn how. And if I cannot see to do them, then you will learn to do them by feel, or you will learn new things. But you will never be useless, Margaret. I will not allow you to believe that about yourself." The conviction in his voice made her chest tight. "Why do you care so much?" Weston was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling on the deer carcass. "Because somewhere along the way you stopped being a charity project and started being important to me, and I protect what is important." Margaret's heart stuttered in her chest. "Weston." "You do not have to say anything," he continued, not meeting her eyes. "I know this was supposed to be just a practical arrangement, but I would be lying if I said that was all it is for me now. I care about you, Margaret, more than I should probably, but I will not push you into anything. If you want to keep things as they are, I will respect that." Margaret stared at his profile, at the strong line of his jaw and the way his hair fell across his forehead. She thought about the last 2 months, about the gentle way he had integrated her into his life, about the evenings by the fire and the sound of his voice reading stories. She thought about how safe she felt with him, how seen, how valued. "What if I do not want to keep things as they are?" she asked softly. Weston turned to look at her then, and even with her failing vision she could see the hope in his eyes. "Then we will change them, whatever way feels right." "I am afraid," Margaret admitted. "I am afraid of being a burden. I am afraid of needing you too much." I am afraid of what happens when I cannot see at all. Then we will be afraid together." Weston reached out and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheek. "But fear is just another feeling, Margaret. It does not have to stop us from living." When he kissed her, it was gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Margaret did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, and kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion she had been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, Weston rested his forehead against hers. "Well," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "that was unexpected." Margaret laughed, surprised by the sound. "Was it? The timing, maybe. I did not plan to kiss you while covered in deer blood." She looked down at their hands, both stained red, and laughed harder. "Perhaps we should finish this task and clean up. Perhaps we should." They worked together in comfortable silence, but everything felt different now. The air between them hummed with new possibility, and every accidental touch sent warmth flooding through Margaret's chest. That evening, after they had both washed thoroughly and changed into clean clothes, they sat closer than usual by the fire. Weston read from a collection of poems, and Margaret leaned against his shoulder, feeling the rumble of his voice through his chest. When he finished, he set the book aside and wrapped an arm around her. "This feels right," he said simply. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "It does." December arrived with a vengeance, bringing a blizzard that lasted 3 days and buried the cabin under 4 feet of snow. They were snowed in completely, unable to even reach the barn without digging a tunnel through the drifts. But inside the cabin, with the fire roaring and supplies plentiful, Margaret found she did not mind the isolation at all. She and Weston fell into a new rhythm, one that included stolen kisses and held hands, quiet conversations late into the night, and a growing intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. Weston moved some of his things into her room, though they both agreed to take things slowly. Margaret's fears had not disappeared, but with Weston beside her they felt manageable. "What will happen when spring comes?" she asked one evening as they lay in bed, Weston's arms wrapped around her. "Will you still go on your travels?" "I will need to take the furs to market," Weston said. "But I was thinking maybe you would come with me. We could go to Cheyenne, sell the furs, get supplies, maybe get married if you are amenable to the idea." Margaret's breath caught. "Married? I know it is fast, but I am 32 years old, Margaret. I have been alone for 8 years, and in that time I never once thought about sharing my life with someone again. Until you make me want things I thought I had given up on. A partner, a real home, maybe even children someday." "I am going blind," Margaret reminded him, though her heart was racing. "I will not be able to do many things. I might need constant help." "Then I will help you. Margaret, I am not offering marriage because I want a housekeeper or a seamstress. I am offering because I love you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to read you stories until we are both old and gray. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face. "I love you too. I did not think I would ever say that to someone, but I do. I love you, Weston Garrett." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Margaret felt the last of her walls crumble. This man, this unexpected blessing, had given her not just shelter but hope, not just safety but love. "Is that a yes to marriage?" Weston asked when they finally broke apart. "Yes," Margaret said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." Winter passed in a blur of contentment. Margaret's vision continued to deteriorate. By February, she could no longer see faces clearly, only shapes and shadows. But with Weston's help, she adapted. He described things to her in detail, painted pictures with words so vivid she could almost see them. And every evening, he read to her by the fire, his voice her window into worlds she could no longer see on her own. They made love for the first time during a February snowstorm, and it was everything Margaret had hoped it would be. Weston was gentle and attentive, taking his time, making sure she felt cherished. Afterward, as they lay tangled together beneath heavy quilts, Margaret felt a completeness she had never known was possible. "I never thought I could be this happy," she whispered into the darkness. "Neither did I," Weston replied, his lips against her hair. "But here we are." Spring came slowly to the mountains, with snow lingering into April. But when the passes finally cleared, Weston loaded the wagon with his winter's catch of furs and helped Margaret pack for the journey. They would be gone several weeks, he explained, time enough to reach Cheyenne, conduct business, and get married properly. The journey down the mountain was easier than the climb up had been, and Margaret found she remembered more of the route than she realized. When they reached Taylorsville, she insisted on stopping at Mrs. Henderson's house. "Margaret," the older woman opened her door with surprise. "We had heard you were dead." "Not dead," Margaret said, smiling. "Just living in the mountains. Mrs. Henderson, this is Weston Garrett. We are going to Cheyenne to be married." The news spread through town like wildfire, and Margaret endured a parade of visitors at the hotel where they stayed the night, all wanting to hear about her mysterious disappearance and sudden engagement. She answered their questions patiently, omitting the details about her vision, simply saying she had found a better situation. In Cheyenne, a bustling city that seemed impossibly loud and crowded after months in the mountains, they completed their business quickly. Weston sold his furs for a good price and used some of the money to buy Margaret a simple gold ring. They were married in a small church by a Methodist minister, with two strangers pulled in off the street to serve as witnesses. "I wish I could see your face clearly," Margaret said as they stood before the minister. Weston took her hand. "I am smiling. The biggest, happiest smile you can imagine. That is what I look like right now. Then that is what I will remember." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Weston kissed her with a passion that made the witnesses chuckle. Margaret did not care. She was married. She had a husband who loved her, a home in the mountains, and a future that no longer seemed frightening. They spent a week in Cheyenne, staying in a proper hotel and enjoying the amenities of civilization. Weston bought supplies for the cabin, including more books from a store that was going out of business. Margaret bought fabric and sewing materials, determined to make new curtains and quilts for their home. But as pleasant as the city was, they were both eager to return to the mountains. The noise and crowds were exhausting, and Margaret missed the peace of the cabin, the sound of the creek, and the evenings by the fire. The journey back took longer than expected due to spring rains that turned the trails to mud, but they finally crested the last ridge and saw the cabin nestled in its valley below. Margaret could not see the details, but she could see the shape of it, and that was enough. "Home," she said softly. "Home," Weston agreed. They settled back into their routine, but everything felt different now. Margaret was no longer a guest or an employee. She was Weston's wife, an equal partner in their mountain life. She threw herself into making the cabin truly theirs, sewing new curtains for the windows and a new quilt for their bed. Weston expanded the garden and built a new chicken coop, determined to have fresh eggs. In June, Margaret realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a mix of joy and terror. How would she care for a child when she could barely see? But Weston's reaction was pure delight. "A baby," he said, his hand on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "I am scared," Margaret admitted. "What if I cannot take care of it properly?" "Then we will figure it out together. Margaret, you are the strongest person I know. If you can learn to butcher a deer while going blind, you can certainly learn to care for a baby." His confidence was infectious, and gradually, Margaret allowed herself to feel excited. They spent the summer preparing, with Weston building a cradle from smooth pine and Margaret sewing tiny clothes and blankets. She worked mostly by feel now, her vision so poor that she could barely distinguish light from dark. But her hands remembered the patterns, and the little gowns and caps she made were perfect. In late January, during a howling snowstorm, Margaret went into labor. Weston had brought a midwife from town, an experienced woman named Mrs. Crawford, who had agreed to stay with them for the last month of Margaret's pregnancy. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. But finally, as dawn broke, Margaret's son entered the world with a lusty cry. "He is perfect," Mrs. Crawford said, placing the baby on Margaret's chest. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a good set of lungs. Margaret could not see her son clearly, only a small, warm weight against her skin. "Describe him to me," she said to Weston, who was kneeling beside the bed with tears streaming down his face. "He has dark hair, lots of it, sticking up in all directions. His eyes are blue right now, but they might change. He has your nose, I think. And he is staring at me like he is trying to figure out who I am." Weston laughed through his tears. "He is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." "What should we name him?" Margaret asked. Weston was quiet for a moment. "What about William, after my father, William Garrett?" Margaret tested the name and smiled. "It is perfect." The next months were a blur of exhaustion and joy. Caring for a newborn was challenging enough, but doing it without clear vision pushed Margaret to her limits. But Weston was there every step of the way, changing diapers, walking the floor with a crying baby in the middle of the night, and gently guiding Margaret's hands when she needed help. And every evening, once William was asleep in his cradle, Weston still read to her by the fire. The stories continued, a constant thread connecting their lives, a reminder of how they had begun. William grew quickly, a happy baby who rarely fussed. By 6 months, he was sitting up and babbling. By a year, he was walking, and Margaret learned to track him by sound, always listening for the patter of his little feet and his gleeful laughter. "He has your eyes," Weston told her one evening as they watched their son play with wooden blocks on the floor. "They changed from blue to hazel, just like yours." "Tell me what he looks like," Margaret said. It had become a ritual, Weston describing their son in detail so she could build a picture in her mind. "He has curly dark hair that will not stay flat no matter how much we comb it. He has a dimple in his left cheek when he smiles. He is sturdy, built solid like me, but he has your delicate features, and he is smart. You can see it in the way he studies things, trying to figure out how they work." Margaret smiled. "He sounds perfect, he is, just like his mother." When William was 2, Margaret became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In November, she gave birth to a daughter they named Mary, after Weston's mother. Mary was a quiet baby, content to lie in her mother's arms and observe the world with solemn eyes. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and stories. Weston continued to trap and hunt, providing for his growing family. Margaret raised their children, teaching them as much as she could by feel and by voice. William learned to read early, and by the time he was 6, he was reading to his mother just as his father did, his young voice stumbling over difficult words but full of determination. Mary was different from her brother, quieter and more thoughtful. She had a gift for music, and Weston bought her a small fiddle when she was 7. She learned to play by ear, filling the cabin with melodies that made Margaret weep with joy. Through it all, Weston remained Margaret's constant companion and support. When her vision finally disappeared completely during her 30th year, he held her through the grief and fear. then helped her learn to navigate a world of permanent darkness. He described everything to her in vivid detail, painting pictures with words. The sunrise, the first snow, the way their children grew and changed, and every single evening without fail he read to her by the fire. "You ever regret it?" Margaret asked him one evening when she was 35 and he was 43. The children were asleep, and they sat together in their chairs by the hearth, her hand in his. "Taking in a blind seamstress, your life would have been simpler without me." "Simpler, maybe," Weston said. "But not better. Never better. Margaret, you gave me a reason to come down from the mountain. You gave me a family, a real home, a purpose beyond just surviving. I would not trade a single day of our life together, not for anything. Even the hard days, especially the hard days. Those are the ones that prove what we have is real." Margaret lifted his hand to her lips and kissed it. "I love you, Weston Garrett. Thank you for reading me stories. I love you too. And I will keep reading as long as I have breath in my body. That is a promise." When William was 16, he announced his intention to go to college back east. He had been studying with a teacher in Taylorsville, riding down from the mountain each week, and had earned a scholarship to study engineering. The news filled Margaret with pride and sadness in equal measure. "He is leaving," she said to Weston the night after William told them. "He is growing up," Weston corrected gently. "It is what children do. We raised him to be independent and curious. This is the result of that, I know, but I will miss him. So will I, but he will come back." The mountains have a way of calling people home. Mary stayed longer, but eventually she too left, moving to Denver to play fiddle in a symphony orchestra. Margaret listened to the increasing quiet of the cabin and tried not to feel bereft. "It is just us again," she said to Weston one evening. "Like the beginning." "Not quite like the beginning," Weston said. "We are older, grayer, creakier, but yes, it is just us." "Is that such a bad thing?" Margaret thought about it and realized it was not. "No, I think I like having you to myself again." "Good. Because I have no intention of going anywhere." They settled into the rhythm of their later years. Weston's hair turned silver and his back began to ache on cold mornings, but he still chopped wood and cared for their home with the same steady determination. Margaret, now completely gray herself, learned to make her own way around the cabin with confidence, her hands sure and steady. And every evening, Weston read to her by the fire. They had cycled through his entire library multiple times, but it did not matter. The stories were not just entertainment anymore. They were the fabric of their life together, the thread that connected their beginning to their present. William came back, as Weston had predicted, bringing a wife and 2 children of their own. He built a house on the far side of the valley and started an engineering business in Cheyenne, traveling back and forth but always returning to the mountains. Mary visited less frequently, but wrote long letters that Weston read aloud, describing her life in Denver and the music she played. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Weston took Margaret's hand and led her outside. It was a warm summer evening and the air smelled of pine and wildflowers. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked. "Just trust me." He guided her to a spot near the creek and helped her sit on a blanket he had spread on the ground. Then he sat beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers. "It is sunset," he said softly. "The sky is on fire with orange and red and purple. The mountains are black silhouettes against the light. The creek is reflecting all the colors like liquid gold, and you are here beside me, which makes it the most beautiful sunset I have ever seen." Margaret felt tears slide down her cheeks. "Tell me more." So he did. Weston described the world to her in loving detail as the sun sank below the mountains. He described the stars as they emerged, the way the moon rose full and bright, the sound of an owl calling from the forest. He described their life together, their children, their home, everything they had built from nothing but trust and hope. "Thank you," Margaret said when he finally fell silent, "for all of it. For the stories, for the life, for seeing me when I could not see myself." "It has been my honor," Weston said, "and my joy." They sat together in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of the mountain, and Margaret knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Years continued to pass. Weston and Margaret grew older together, their pace slower but their love undiminished. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The cabin saw generations pass through its doors, filled always with the sound of Weston's voice reading stories by the fire. On a winter evening just after Margaret's 50th birthday, she sat in her chair by the fire while Weston read from one of their favorite books, a collection of poems they had read together hundreds of times. His voice was rougher now, affected by age, but still strong and sure. "I have been thinking," Margaret said when he paused, "about how lucky I am." "Lucky?" Weston closed the book. "How so?" "I lost my sight, but I gained you. I lost my shop, but I gained a home. I lost my independence, but I gained a partner who never made me feel like I had lost anything at all." "That seems like a fair trade." "More than fair," Weston agreed. "Though I would argue I got the better end of the deal. Argue all you want, I know the truth." He laughed, the sound warm and rich. "Shall I keep reading, please?" As his voice filled the cabin once more, Margaret closed her sightless eyes and let the words wash over her. She thought about the girl she had been, terrified and alone, watching her world disappear. She thought about the mountain man who had offered her safety and ended up giving her everything. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the mountains in white. Inside, the fire crackled and a man read to his wife, and love filled every corner of their home. It was, Margaret thought, the happiest ending she could have ever imagined. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Not because she had gotten everything she wanted, but because she had found everything she needed. And every evening by the fire, Weston kept his promise. He read to her, his voice her guide through the darkness, his love her constant light. When Weston was 60 and Margaret was 52, he began to slow down noticeably. The mountain winters had been hard on him, and though he tried to hide it, Margaret could hear the exhaustion in his voice. William suggested they move to town, to a comfortable house where Weston would not have to work so hard, but Weston refused. "I will leave these mountains when they carry me down," he said firmly. "Not before." Margaret understood. This was their home, their sanctuary, the place where they had built their life. She could not imagine leaving it either, but she worried. One morning in early spring, when Margaret was 55 and Weston was 63, she woke to find him still asleep beside her. This was unusual. Weston always rose with the sun, even in his later years. She reached out to touch his face and found his skin cool. "Weston," she whispered, shaking him gently. He stirred and groaned. "I am fine, just tired." "You are never tired in the morning." "Well, I am today." He sat up slowly, and she could hear the effort it took. "I will be fine once I move around." But he was not fine. Over the following weeks, Weston grew weaker. He tried to hide it, tried to maintain their normal routine, but Margaret knew him too well. She heard the tremble in his hands when he poured coffee, felt the way he leaned on furniture as he moved through the cabin. William brought a doctor from Cheyenne, a young man who examined Weston thoroughly and spoke to him in private. After the doctor left, Weston sat Margaret down and took her hands in his. "My heart is giving out," he said simply. "The doctor says I have maybe a year, maybe less. There is nothing to be done." Margaret felt as if the ground had opened beneath her. "No, that cannot be right. You are strong." "You are the strongest man I know." "I am 63 years old and I have lived a hard life, Margaret, this is not unexpected. I am surprised I have lasted this long. I am not ready, she said, her voice breaking. I am not ready to lose you, I know. I am not ready either. He pulled her into his arms, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek, steady but weak. But we do not get to choose these things. We only get to choose how we spend the time we have left. Then what do? We live, Weston said. Just like we always have. We enjoy every day. And every evening I will read to you by the fire, for as long as I can. And that is what they did. Through the summer and into the fall they lived. William and Mary came to visit frequently, bringing their children and grandchildren. The cabin was filled with noise and laughter and life, and Weston soaked it all in like a man storing sunshine for winter. In the evenings, when the visitors had left and it was just the two of them again, Weston read. His voice grew weaker, sometimes faltering on words he had spoken effortlessly for decades. But he pushed through, determined to keep his promise. One evening in late October, as the aspen leaves turned gold outside, Weston struggled to read more than a few pages before exhaustion overtook him. Margaret took the book from his trembling hands and set it aside. "It is all right," she said softly. "You do not have to read tonight. But I promised. Every evening by the fire I promised you. And you have kept that promise for 28 years. That is enough, my love." "That is more than enough." Weston was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Will you tell me a story instead? Tell me about us, about the day we met." So Margaret did. She told him about the moment he walked into her shop, how he had filled the doorway with his presence, how his directness had startled her. She told him about the first time he read to her, how his rough voice had smoothed out as he found the rhythm of the words. She told him about falling in love, about their first kiss over a deer carcass, about the way he had made her feel safe and seen and valued. "It has been a good life," Weston said when she finished. "The best life I could have imagined." "The best," Margaret agreed, tears streaming down her face. That night, Weston fell asleep in his chair by the fire, and Margaret sat beside him, holding his hand. She did not want to move him, did not want to disturb him. So she stayed, listening to his breathing, memorizing the feel of his hand in hers. In the morning, Weston did not wake up. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, exactly where he wanted to be, in his cabin in the mountains beside the woman he loved. Margaret sat with him for a long time, holding his hand, talking to him as if he could still hear. She told him she loved him. She thanked him for reading her stories, for seeing her worth when she could not see it herself, for giving her a life beyond what she had ever dreamed possible. When William arrived later that day, he found his mother sitting beside his father's body, dry-eyed but pale. "He is gone," she said simply. "I know, Mama. I am so sorry." They buried Weston on a hillside overlooking the valley, beneath a pine tree that had been there longer than any of them. The whole family came for the funeral, and neighbors from town made the difficult journey up the mountain to pay their respects. Everyone spoke of Weston's strength, his kindness, his quiet competence, but it was Margaret who spoke most truly of the man she had loved. "He saved me," she said, standing over his grave with William's steadying hand on her arm. "Not just from blindness or poverty or loneliness, but from a life half-lived. He taught me that being alive was about moments that made you feel something real. And he gave me nearly 30 years of those moments. I could not see him clearly after the first few months we knew each other, but I never needed to. I saw him with my heart, and that vision never failed." After the funeral, William tried again to convince Margaret to move to town. "You cannot stay up here alone, Mama. It is too isolated, too hard." "This is my home," Margaret said firmly. "This is where Weston and I built our life. I am not leaving it." "But how will you manage?" "The same way I have managed for the last 30 years, one day at a time." In the end, they compromised. Mary moved back to the cabin to live with her mother, bringing her fiddle and her music. She was not married, had chosen her art over domesticity, and she was happy to care for Margaret while pursuing her own work. Life in the cabin continued, different but not empty. Mary described the world to Margaret just as Weston had, painted pictures with words. She played her fiddle in the evenings, filling the space where Weston's voice had been. It was not the same, but it was something. But Margaret missed the stories. She missed the sound of Weston's voice reading to her by the fire. So one evening, about a month after his death, she asked Mary to read to her. "Which book?" Mary asked. "The Last of the Mohicans," Margaret said without hesitation. "The first book your father ever read to me." Mary settled into Weston's chair and began to read, her voice higher and softer than her father's had been, but clear and expressive. Margaret closed her eyes and let the familiar words wash over her. It hurt, hearing the story without Weston, but it also brought comfort. The stories had been their connection, their ritual, their shared joy. By continuing to read them, she was keeping a part of him alive. Every evening, Mary read. They worked their way through the books on the shelves, the same books Weston had read to Margaret over and over across the years. And with each story, Margaret felt closer to the man she had lost. Years passed. Margaret grew old gracefully, her white hair worn in a long braid, her face lined with the marks of a life well lived. She spent her days in the cabin or sitting on the porch, listening to the sounds of the mountain. She could navigate every inch of her home by memory, knew every board and nail. William visited regularly with his family, and eventually his children brought their children, filling the cabin with noise and chaos that Margaret loved. They called her grandmother, and she told them stories about their grandfather, about the mountain man who had saved a blind seamstress and loved her for the rest of his life. On the evening of Margaret's 70th birthday, the whole family gathered at the cabin. It was summer, and they ate outside, filling the valley with laughter and music. Mary played her fiddle, and William's grandchildren danced. As the sun set and the family began to settle around a large fire, William's youngest grandchild, a boy of 7 named Weston after his great-grandfather, climbed onto Margaret's lap. "Grandmother," he said, "will you tell us a story?" Margaret smiled and wrapped her arms around the child. "What kind of story would you like to hear? A true one, about you and great-grandfather." So Margaret told them. She told them about losing her sight, about the shop in Taylorsville, about the day a mountain man walked through her door and changed her life forever. She told them about the first evening by the fire, about learning to live in the mountains, about falling in love with a man who saw her worth when she could not see it herself. She told them about the bear, about learning to butcher a deer, about their wedding in Cheyenne. She told them about William's birth during a snowstorm and Mary's quiet arrival on a November night. She told them about the years of reading by the fire, about how stories had been the thread connecting their lives. "He read to me every single evening," Margaret said, her voice soft with memory. "For 28 years, he kept that promise. And even now, when I sit by the fire and listen to stories, I can hear his voice. That is the gift he gave me. Not just stories, but a way to see the world that did not require eyes. A way to feel alive that did not depend on what I could or could not do. He taught me that love was not about perfection or ability. It was about showing up every single day and choosing each other, again and again." The family sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling, the stars emerging overhead. "That is the most beautiful story I have ever heard," young Weston said. "It is a true one," Margaret replied. "And the best part is it is not over yet. Every day I wake up in the home we built, surrounded by the family we created, I am still living our story. It just has a different ending than I expected. That night, after the family had dispersed to various beds throughout the cabin and the temporary tents set up outside, Margaret sat alone by the dying fire. Mary had fallen asleep reading, her book abandoned on her lap. The cabin was quiet except for the soft breathing of her sleeping family and the pop and hiss of the coals. Margaret sat in her chair, Weston's empty chair beside her, and spoke softly into the darkness. "I miss you," she said. "Every single day I miss you, but I am all right. I am still here, still living, still finding moments that make me feel alive, just like you taught me." She sat there until the fire burned down to embers, then made her way carefully to bed, her hands sure on the familiar path. She lay down beneath quilts she had sewn decades ago, in a room that smelled of pine and memory, and closed her sightless eyes. And she dreamed of a mountain man with gray eyes and a deep voice, reading stories to her by the fire, forever and ever. Margaret Walsh Garrett lived to be 78 years old. She passed peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning, with Mary holding her hand and sunshine streaming through the window. They buried her beside Weston on the hillside, beneath the same pine tree, and the family gathered once more to say goodbye. But the cabin remained. William kept it maintained, and eventually his son took over its care, then his son's daughter. It became a family retreat, a place where generations came to remember their ancestors and hear the stories of the blind seamstress and the mountain man who loved her. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind is just right, people swear they can hear a deep voice reading softly, telling stories by a fire that burned out long ago, keeping a promise that was never truly broken. Because love, real love, does not end when the story stops. It echoes through the years, in the children raised and the lives touched and the memories cherished. It lives in the quiet moments and the loud ones, in the laughter and the tears, in the everyday and the extraordinary. Margaret and Weston's love lived on, not just in the family they created, but in the example they set. Of two broken people who found each other and built something whole. Of a woman who refused to let her disability define her, and a man who saw her strength when the world saw only her weakness. Of stories read by firelight and promises kept and a life lived fully, even in darkness. Their story had an ending, but it was not a sad one. It was the ending they both would have chosen, surrounded by love in the home they built together, having lived a life that mattered. And every evening, by the fire, someone still reads stories in that cabin, carrying on a tradition that began with a mountain man and a seamstress losing her sight, and grew into a legacy of love that would never fade.